Hello everyone, and welcome to the Intro to Android workshop. Today's going to be a 1 hour, very basic workshop talking about some of the introductory concepts for Android development. I'm hoping that everyone leaving the workshop today will understand a little bit more about Android development and where to get started. Alright, so before we begin, let me quickly talk about who I am and my experiences with Android. My name is Bobby Wong. I'm a 4A computer science student at the University of Waterloo. And as for my Android experience, I've done 3 Android internships in the past, and I have 1 planned upcoming Android internship for summer 2021. So lots of Android experience. Outside of a work setting, I've also published 2 Google Play Store apps on my own, so really proud of those as well. Alright, so before I talk about the agenda for today, let me quickly talk about some points about this workshop. So first of all, this workshop won't cover any Kotlin or any languages to do with Android actually, and I'll be talking about why that is in a little bit. Secondly, I won't be covering any architecture or code styling because this is still a hackathon, and I don't think those things will help you guys that much. Finally, I don't want this workshop to become like a quick start guide where I'm just showing you guys how to apply instructions. I really want you guys to come out of this understanding why you're applying those instructions. So let's talk about today's agenda then. After this, we'll be talking about the key principles of Android development, and hopefully these key points will help you guys understand Android a lot more. The rest of the workshop after that will be dissecting and picking apart a basic Android application to help you guys understand each individual component. We'll be having a short 5-minute break between then, so if you're having trouble setting up your Android Studio, we can help you out then. And then we have a short summary at the end where I'll be summarizing all the things we learned today. Alright, let me tell all of you guys how I got started with Android development back in freshman year of university. So back then, I felt like I had a good understanding of computer science concepts and how to program, but I didn't really see how I could use my knowledge of how to sort lists and whatnot to actually create a fully functional Android program. And actually, one thing I really struggled with at the time is that even though I could follow the guides and whatever, I didn't really feel like I was learning much from them. It's kind of like if you receive the world's clearest and best written set of instructions, you still won't feel comfortable going into a server room and pushing random buttons and unplugging random cables. I really felt like I wanted to understand why I was following the steps in the instructions instead of just applying them blindly. And that's kind of one of the guiding principles that I followed when I made this workshop. I really want all of you guys coming out of this workshop to understand Android development a little bit more instead of just understanding how to do certain tasks. Alright, let's get right into talking about the key concepts of Android development. And let's start by answering the question I just posed: how you can use your traditional programming knowledge to create a fully functional Android application. And the answer to that, actually, is the Android operating system. The Android operating system provides an SDK, a set of tools for developers to use to basically accomplish anything the developer might want. Basically, this SDK is the bridge between traditional programming knowledge and specific Android tasks. So, using your traditional programming knowledge, you should be able to call and use the SDK features, and the SDK features will basically go to the operating system and translate that into the nitty-gritties of the Android phone. So one example of that could be, let's say your application wants to vibrate the phone at some point for whatever reason. Even without understanding of, like the hardware vibrator and how like vibrations are set up in the phone's firmware and whatnot, all the developer needs to do is call this one simple function from the Android SDK where you can easily specify how long and how intense the vibration should be. And just by calling that one function, the rest is handled by the SDK and the phone will vibrate just like you want it to. This is kind of why it's not important to know Kotlin or Java that well for Android development. Your success as an Android developer is really reliant on your knowledge of the Android SDK. It's not that reliant on your knowledge of the actual language itself, since you're working so closely with the SDK. One caveat to this, however, is that because you're working so closely with the SDK, then if something we want to do isn't supported by the SDK, then we're really out of luck here. There's not much we can do. And one example of that is, let's say, so for Android phones, when you start typing somewhere, then the keyboard pops up from the bottom, right? And maybe as a developer, you would like to know when that keyboard is visible or not. And that sounds really simple and really important, but there's actually no SDK support for that. There's no function to call to tell us, basically. And because there's no SDK support, then this simple and important feature just never had a good solution for years, basically. So hopefully that should clear up what Android development is kind of about. It's really about just working with the Android SDK. And let's quickly answer then what working with SDK is like. So let's talk about at a high level what things need to happen in order for us to write an app and have that app be loaded up by the Android operating system. And the easiest way to talk about that actually is to pretend that we're the Android operating system. So let's think about, if we're the operating system, what are some things that we need from the developer in order to properly show their app? Okay, so the first one is the most unclear from a newcomer perspective, but the operating system needs to know the metadata and the contents of the application, like the basic structure of the application. So, for example, how many screens does the application have? What are the screens called? What can the screens accomplish? What's the application name? What icon should we use for the application? Things like that. The next thing that the operating system needs is, it obviously needs the UI for the application. So the application is going to have some screens. The operating system needs to know what those screens look like. How is it laid out? What assets does it use? Does it use images? Which images? And the developer needs to provide all of these also to the operating system. The last thing the operating system needs, and this one should be fairly obvious as well, is that the operating system needs the code that powers the application. So, the code that you wrote, which makes the functions work, makes the application work. The operating system obviously needs that to run so that your application actually does something. For each of these three components, we'll be going over them in detail and how we accomplish supplying all of these three in the Android development stack after the break. With that said, let's get ready to start on the practical part of this workshop, where we'll be working with an actual Android Studio project. So I want everyone to open up Android Studio and have that ready for after the break. All right, everyone, welcome back from the break. Let's get started with the first part of the Android stack, which is understanding the part of the OS that needs to know what the metadata and the structure of your application is. So the OS needs to know about what the application name is, what icon to use, and the general structures and screens of your application. We'll be covering on how we'll be providing all those data in this section. But before we can begin, let's quickly talk about how to create and work with a simple Android application. I want everyone to open up Android Studio. And if you open up Android Studio and you already have the empty application open, or you're working with the GitHub repository that I've provided in the syllabus, then don't worry about this screen right now. If you're working with a GitHub, you want to open it through here. But if not, I'm going to be showing everyone how to create a new application, a new project from scratch. So everyone who's following along, if you're here, then just click on create a new project. Okay, this screen is for selecting what you want to use as a starting point for an Android application. Just like art, however, you kind of want to start with a blank canvas so you can create whatever you want. So I recommend everyone start with an empty activity. So empty activity, next. Okay, this screen is where you name your application. So let's name it something simple like Intro to Android. Package name, you won't have to worry about for now. Package name is used more for if you want to publish your application onto the Play Store and whatnot. Save location is pretty explanatory. This is where your project's going to go on your file system. Okay, this one's important. Which language to use, Java or Kotlin? I know I talked about before how it doesn't really matter which language you learn for Android development. However, I still do recommend everyone pick Kotlin over Java because Kotlin is much nicer to work with than Java. and it provides a lot of advantages over Java. So please pick Kotlin. Even if you have Java experience, please pick Kotlin. Okay, last thing on this page is minimum SDK. So this is kind of like which version of Android you want your application to support. If you pick a really low version, then that means more phones are going to be supported, since there's going to be more phones running older and older versions. But if you pick a newer version, then there's not going to be a lot of phones that's going to support it. But by using a newer version, you'll have more access to newer SDK features. For hackathons, you'll probably just end up picking whichever API version your test device is currently running, or the newest one if you're working with an API, with an emulated phone. But I usually stick with API 21, so that's the one I'm going to pick. Don't worry about this one, you probably won't need to worry about it. And then we're finally going to click Finish. And that should create a blank Android Studio project. Alright, now that we have an Android Studio project open, I want to start off by talking about some things you're probably going to be seeing immediately. So the first thing I want to talk about is that on the top left corner, you're going to notice a little tab called the Projects tab. And if you open it, this will open up the file exploring system that we'll be using to open and navigate to the various files we'll be modifying for Android development. You're also going to notice a little drop down here, and I'll be quickly explaining what each of these drop down options mean. So first of all, the project option will basically show you all of the files in your project laid out exactly like they are on your file exploring system. So this is basically exactly like how the files are structured on your disk. If you open it up again, then the one I want y'all to use is the Android one. So if you select Android, this one is basically Android Studio will take all the files it thinks you'll use and condense them into one view here. So because this is a condensed view of all the important files, this is the one we'll be working with, as it's more friendly for beginners. Okay, we're now ready to talk about our first topic, which is going to be the manifest file. I want everyone to open up this manifest folder and open up Android manifest.xml. So, like I said already, the Android operating system needs some way of knowing the metadata and the structure of our application. And it's not really realistic for the Android operating system to parse our code to figure that stuff out. So we need to tell it in a specific and unique way. And we do that using this XML file. XML is basically like JSON. It's just a way to represent data in a way that's easy for computers to kind of understand. If we read through this XML file, there should already be a few things that make sense to you. So for example, we have this application object here, and this is basically our way of telling the Android operating system that our application exists. These attributes here are ways of telling the Android operating system attributes about our application. Like for example, the label for our application, or the name for our application, is Intro to Android. The icon for our application is this one. Our application allows backups. The theme for our application is this one, so on and so forth. Moving down, you're going to notice this little activity block, and I'll be explaining what activities are in the code section, but for now, you can just imagine an activity as one screen in your application. So our application currently has one screen, the main activity screen. Okay. The last thing in this file is the intent filter here, and I actually won't be covering them in too much detail here because you most likely will not be working with intent filters. What intent filters are a way of telling the Android operating system of what tasks this screen can accomplish. So, for example, if you've ever used an Android phone before and you wanted to share a file, then you might click the file and click share, and the Android operating system will show a little window saying, oh, do you want to share it with your email app or the messaging app or whatever? And obviously there's some way that the Android operating system knew that those applications are capable of sharing. Intent filters are the way of doing that. So if we were making it a screen that could share other things, then we would add an intent filter here telling the Android operating system that this screen it can share other things. In a hackathon setting, I'd imagine that most of you are probably just making applications that complete one task on its own. It's not really working to complete things for other applications. So you most likely will not be using intent filters. The intent filter here is actually to tell the Android operating system that this screen is the one to use as the launcher screen. So you might have noticed the main activity here and thought just it's like Java where it's always gonna look for a main kind of class or function or whatever, but that's not really the case. The thing that Android will execute first is it's whatever screen has this main launcher intent filter. Okay, so we'll be adding if we need to add a second screen, then we'll also need to modify this manifest file so that the Android operating system is aware of our second screen, for example. And I'll be showing you guys how to do that in a little bit. This manifest file is also responsible for declaring permissions. So like if your application needs the internet, for example, then it'd be in this file where you define like a permission little icon, a little permissions tag here. So the Android operating system knows that your application needs those certain permissions. All right, we're ready to talk about the next part of the Android stack now. So, which is going to be the build.gradle files. So I want everyone to go back to this projects tab and open up the build.gradle scripts folder. And in here, the two files we care about are both called build.gradle. They're both have the same name because they accomplish the same thing. The only difference is one is for your project and one is for your module. If your project is really big, you can split it up into more than one module, but you probably won't have to worry about it because having more than one module is only something that really large projects have. So you'll most likely only have one module. So for us, let's just open up the module build.gradle here. So now that we have this file open, let's quickly talk about what we're seeing here. The build.gradle is basically the file that Android Studio will use to build our application. So we can write all the code we want, but it still needs to be built into a format that can be loaded onto an Android phone and understood by the Android operating system. And basically, this is a file that Android Studio will use to accomplish that task. You can kind of think of this as kind of like a make file for C, if you've worked with that before. You'll notice some of the settings, some of the parameters here listed here will probably make a lot of sense. So, for example, what is the minimum Android SDK version that we should support? What's the application ID called? What version code does this build have? Things like if it's a release build, then what special settings should we use? Most importantly for you guys, this is the file that we use to add new dependencies and libraries. So for example, if you want to use a new library, for example, to make API calls, then this is where you'll be adding that. There's usually going to be instructions on how to add it to this file in the dependency documentation page. Up at the top, there's also a thing called plugins. And the difference between plugins and dependencies is that dependencies is something that will be used by the code during execution. So, making API calls is something that happens while the code is running. Whereas plugins here is something that the developer uses to make development easier. So, for example, here, you notice the ID call in Android. This is a plugin that makes working with Kotlin easier for Android development. And actually, let's get coding right away here. I want everyone to add a new plugin for us to use. So let's copy that one and paste it. And let's add in at the end -extensions. Let's click sync now. And just like that, we've added a new plugin for us to use that will make working with Kotlin for Android even easier. Okay, so to summarize, for the building and the Android OS know about the structure of an application, it uses the Android manifest file to understand the application structure and parameters and permissions if there's any. And Android Studio uses build.gradle to help build the application. Alright, now that we're done with the first section, let's move on along to the second section, where we'll be talking about how we can tell the Android OS what the UI of our application looks like. So what does the screens in our applications look like? Okay, so to get started, I want everyone to open up the Projects tab again and navigate to the Res folder. The Res folder will contain all the resources that's not code that your application might need. So, for example, if you want to use a PNG or an image of some sort, then it would go in the Drawables folder. If you want to use a certain color a lot in your application and have a consistent color scheme, then you can define it in the Colors folder. And the one we really care about for today is the Layouts folder. So I want everyone to open up Activity Main. Let's close the Projects tab so I can save some space. Okay, and the first thing you'll see is probably something along the lines of this. On the top right corner, I want everyone to select the Code tab. And this will open up what looks like another XML folder. How UI in Android is handled is through these XML files. So no matter how fancy a screen looks, it's not actually a screen that someone drew. It's just a file containing XML text like this. So if you're familiar with HTML, this is very similar. We're not actually drawing new views. We're just defining where predefined views go through text like this. Okay, now back to the top right corner, I want everyone to click on the Design tab. And the Design tab is basically a preview that Android Studio generates for us so that working with UI can become a little bit easier. And the first thing I want to point out is this little palette section. And just like a real palette, this will give us a little selection of views that we might be interested in using. Let's talk about what a view is real quick. So we're going to notice in this little preview, there's already one view already, and it's called a text view. Just like the name describes, it displays text in a view that the user can see. And text views are pretty simple. You'll probably be working with them a lot. Okay, let's go back to the Code tab. And you can see that the same text view we saw on that preview is represented here in text. Okay, so let's make the first change to this XML file. We have to do this in the Code tab. So I want everyone to select this entire line here and replace it with linear layouts. The thing we just replaced is a constraint layout, and although constraint layouts are awesome and super handy to use, they're a bit too complicated for the scope of this workshop, so I've saved that for the intermediate workshop. What a layout is a layout will have views inside of it, kind of like its children, and it will lay them out in some way. Linear layout is the simplest one. It'll just lay out all of its children in a line. So for example, if we go back to the Design tab, we can see from the component tree that there's a main linear layout, and we can go to the palette, select text view, and add another layout into it, either by dragging it into the preview or into the component tree. And we just added a new view into our layout. And just like the name linear layout suggests, the new view is just added in a line like this. Okay, let's go back to the Code tab where I want to make some changes. So views are nice, but we want to be able to change them to behave the way we want as well. So one thing I noticed is that it's laying views out horizontally. I don't want that. I want to lay them out vertically. So I'm going to change one of its Android attributes. I'm going to change its orientation to be vertical. And I want it to be centered as well, so I'm going to do Android gravity, not layout gravity, normal gravity, to be center. And just by adding these two attributes in, if you go back to the design tab, we can see that, yep, the views are now vertical and they are centered. This view is oddly large, and I from experience, I know that's because of this little thing here, Android layout weight 1. It got auto-generated in for us, but we don't really want it, so let's just erase that. And you can see here, the view is normally sized again. Alright. But like I said, anything you can do in the design tab, we can do in the code and the actual file as well. So let's add in a new view using this by changing the actual file itself. Let's add in a button with, okay, wrap content just means the view should only be big enough to enclose its content. Wrap button. And let's have the button say button. Let's close that with a slash. And because we added this text block here, if you go to the design preview, we see that the button is now present. Okay, some of you might be thinking that it seems a bit restrictive to only be bound to these predefined views in the Android SDK. You know, what if you want to create fancy looking UIs like this one here in this image? And some of you might be thinking of making your own custom views, and my recommendation for that is don't, because the views inside the Android SDK is pretty comprehensive, and you can pretty much create any view you want with just the views that Android provides you. For example, this view you see here actually uses the exact same view component as the one above it. The only difference is that it has its attributes changed to look much nicer. So, like this slide suggests, let's try some of that ourselves. I want this button to not be purple, so I can accomplish that just by changing its attributes instead of making a custom button view or something like that. So let's do background tint is black. And just like that, the button is now black, just like I wanted. Alright, so the last thing I want to talk about is IDs. In the top right, in the attributes summary here, you're going to notice the first thing is an ID. And IDs are really important, so let's add one right now, button. Because if you ever want to work with a view in code, then that view needs to have its own unique ID. So we can see here, now that the button has an ID, we can work with it when we write our code later on. I also want this text view to have an ID as well, so let's copy this and paste it. And IDs need to be unique, so let's just make this text view too. Alright, I hope that makes it clear on how views are handled in Android Studio. All they really are these text files. They're kind of like HTML in that sense. Some views are visual, like the text view and the buttons, and some views just help to lay things out, like this linear layout. There's a design tab that will give you a preview of what it might look like on a phone, but the text file is what it really is. And you might be tempted to only work in the design view, but it really is also important to work with the code view as well. I usually work in the split view, but I'm not doing this today because it's a bit squished since I have to do split screen to show you guys. Alright, now that we're done talking about how we can make visually appealing screens for our application, let's move on and talk about how we can add our code into our application. Because after all, we probably want our applications to do complicated things like this when they're clicked on. And I did promise that the button will do something when we press on it, and as you can see here, even though the screen looks exactly like how we want it to, nothing happens when we press on the button. Okay, before we can talk about how to add our code into an application, the first thing we need to talk about are activities and the activity lifecycle. So unlike traditional pieces of code, Android code isn't really something that you run start to finish, because an application like the one we just have can be started up at any point by the user, and they can be stopped at any time by the user as well. So that's why we need this lifecycle. It's kind of hard to read here, but the general gist of the lifecycle is that for any screen an application has, it will go through this process where when it's created, it will be created, started, resumed. And after it's gone through those 3 steps, it'll be active like it is here. And at any point, the user can stop the application by pausing it and stopping and destroying it, just like that. Okay, so now I want to go into Android Studio, and I want everyone to open up the Java folder here. I know it's called Java, even though we picked Kotlin. This is really just a relic of the past, but yeah, open up the Java folder, open up this directory that's not in green, and I want everyone to open up main activity. And we can see here that it's in fact a Kotlin file, and there's one function right now inside the main activity class called onCreate. And just like the lifecycle we talked about before, create is one of the steps in the lifecycle. So basically, whenever we start the application up, it's going to start up main activity as the first screen. It's going to create that screen, that activity. And when it's finished creating that screen, that activity, it's going to call its own onCreate function because, onCreate, it's in the name. However, what we did here is that we've overridden the default onCreate function, and we've overridden it to do our own code, basically. And this is basically how we can get our code into an Android application, because any screen has to be created, and when it's created, it has to call its onCreate function. So we can just override the onCreate function and inject our own code in after here. Let's talk about the 2 lines that are generated for us. First is super.onCreate. This basically just means we should call the original onCreate as well. Even though we're overwriting it, we probably still wanted to execute the original onCreate function because it's probably doing something important. So we just quickly call that here as the first step. The second step, set content view r.layout.activityJava. This line basically is saying that for this screen, we should set the view, the content of the screen, to be this layout file, which is the one we created from earlier. And actually, if we remove or comment out this line, we can see that if we try running it, now instead of our own fancy UI, there's just nothing there because we never set the contents. Anyways, let's just put that back in. Okay, and now let's talk about how we can work with views now. The first thing we need to talk about is, like I said before, in order to work with a view, we need to get its ID. So let's work with the second text view. Its ID is text view 2, so let's copy that. And let's paste it here. And you'll probably see it in red because you still need to import the view from the respective layout file. So I'm going to do Alt-Enter. If you're on Mac, I believe it's Command or Option-Enter. It's one of those two. But that will basically import in the view from the layout file like this. And now we can work with that view directly in the code. And how we do that is by modifying that view's various member variables and functions. So let's say we want to change its text. So all we do is just change its text variable to become whatever we want, really. So let's do new message. Just like that. And now if we build it, we can see that the UI is back and the second text view now says new message. So hopefully that makes sense. In order to work with views in code, we need to refer to it by its ID. And to modify it, we'll have to modify one of its member variables or work with one of its functions. So let's do that again. Let's say we want to work with a button this time. So the ID for the button is called button. And let's make it do something when we click on it. And actually, it's adjusting the right function right away. So set onClickListener. That's the one we want. Okay, it's gonna generate this. It's gonna generate this function call, and this function accepts a lambda. If you're not familiar with what lambdas are, don't worry. It's basically like a block of code, like a little mini function. And if we just copy this into here, if we just move this into here, then basically what we're doing right now is we're telling Android Studio that when the button is clicked, we should run this block of code. So set the text, use text to new message. And if we do that, we can see that before we change it, it's still saying text view, but if we press a button, it's now a new message. So the bulk of Android work is going to be learning about the member variables and functions of whatever view component you're working with. It can get very complicated, but there's a lot of flexibility and freedom in what you can accomplish with this, basically. All right, now let's move on and talk about how we can start a new activity when we press the button. So the first thing we need is to create a new activity. So let's open up the projects tab again. I don't want to type in everything from scratch. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to copy. I'm going to click on the main activity. I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to paste it. And I'm going to rename the new file to second activity. So just like that, instead of having to rewrite everything, I'm just going to copy and paste the main activity and use this as the starting point. I'm going to do the same thing with activity main. So copy, paste, and let's call that activity second. And let's close that back up. So let's change the view so it's visually distinct, and you can do that just by removing the second text view and the button. So now it's just one text view again. So yeah, we're done with second activity now. Activity second now. Let's close that. Okay, and let's just clear the code from second activity for now. All right, back in new activity, let's make it so when we press a button, it launches a new activity. And we do that by instantiating in here a new value, a new intent value. I know in the manifest section, I said that we won't have to worry about intents too much, and I stand by that because the intents I was talking about there are actually what's called implicit intents. And that's because those intent filters are meant for intents where they're not for any one particular activity. You know, if you're sending an implicit intent, for example, because you want to share something, then you don't really care about which activity ends up sharing it. You just want some activity to share it in the end. The intent I'm about to define here is what's called explicit intent, because this intent will be used to start up a specific activity, in this case, second activity. And we also need to do : class.java. I never remember this. I just look it up when I need to use it. But anyways, and we do that with the start activity function call. And we pass into it the intent we just created. Oh, did I spell it wrong? Yeah, I spelled it wrong. Oh, no. Okay. So you can kind of think of this as we're creating a letter and we're sending it off to the Android operating system. And that letter is basically telling the Android operating system that we want to start an activity, and the activity we want to start is this one. And just like any letter, we can actually attach messages to this letter. So we do that by doing intent dot, we can put an extra onto this message. And we do that by attaching a key value pair. So first we need a name for this little message we're about to send off, something we can refer to it by. So let's just do key message, just anything will do. And then we need a value along with it. And you can see from this list here, that value can be pretty much whatever. It can be a Boolean or an int. In this case, let's make it a string. Let's make it test message. All capitals. Okay, just like that. And now basically, we're pretty much ready to start up the new activity. Okay, but before we do that, let's go into second activity and make it do something on creation. And actually, when we use an intent to start an activity, that intent is passed into the activity as well. So this intent that we created here, it actually gets passed in here, and we can get that intent, the exact same intent, from here. So we can get the string extra by passing in the key we used earlier. So the key is this. Let's copy and paste that. So yeah, this is how we can basically pass information between activities by attaching them to the intent. And let's do something with that string. Let's do text view dot text equals. And it's not from activity main, so let's erase that. And let's re-import it to make sure we're importing it from activity second, this one. Perfect. All right, so everything should be ready. Let's run our application. So our application is ready. And actually, a bit of a spoiler alert, I know what's going to happen when I push this button. It's actually going to crash. Okay, and I know why it crashed, but I want to quickly show you guys how to debug errors when they come up. So the first thing we should do is open up logcat on the bottom here. If you don't see it, you can also do View, Tools window, and select logcat, which will also open it up. And what logcat will basically do is it will log the application activity as it's happening. So when we press the button, it's going to log the error message for us. So let's read that error message. That looks pretty clear. Activity not found exception. Unable to find explicit activity class, second activity. Have you declared this activity in your Android manifests.xml? And that's pretty clear on what we didn't do. And I did promise earlier that I'll show you guys how to add things to the manifest file when we need to. So it's pretty simple. All we have to do is just add a new item here into the manifest. So let's copy that activity and paste it. Let's change its name to be second activity, and you can see here it's completing it for us because it recognizes it. And let's remove the intent filter because we only need one launcher activity, one launcher screen. Okay, so with that little change, it should be ready. So let's rerun it, and hey, it's working. Except, oh yeah, I forgot to change this here. Oopsie daisies. So let's run that again. Yay! So yeah, everything's working accordingly. But I think it's important to know debugging tools, so I'm going to show you one last debugging tool before we end this section, which is going to be how to launch in debugger mode. So if you've worked with debugging mode before, the first thing you need to do is add a breakpoint. So beside the line number you want to add the breakpoint to, just click on it, and this little red circle should show up. And now all you have to do is just launch in debug mode by pressing this little button. And what this is going to do is, whenever this line of code is executed, Android Studio will pause program execution for us. And that lets us go in and kind of figure out what's going on. So my favorite thing to do here is to select whatever piece of code I'm trying to evaluate, right click on it, and evaluate expression. Evaluate. And this lets me see exactly what's going on in this piece of code I'm trying to figure out. I purposely selected this because this is the only thing I haven't explained yet. This, in this case, actually refers to the main activity. So this is our chance to look into what the main activity really is. And if you can read this, then all an activity really is a collection of variables that represent what's currently going on the screen. So for example, is the screen resumed? Yes, it is. Is it stopped? No, it isn't. Does it have an action bar? No, it doesn't. So on and so forth. The reason we need to pass it to the intent is because the Android operating system needs to know where it came from in order to transition to the new activity, basically. All right. With that, that should be everything you need to know in order to work with coding in Android Studio. Basically, you're going to be working with views by referencing their ID, and you'll most likely be modifying or using some of their variables or parameters or functions. All right, now that we had a chance to talk about coding in Android Studio, let's do a little quick mini question. For this question, it's really quite simple. All I'm gonna do is move the intent filter from main activity into the second activity. And I want you guys to try and answer which of these 5 options happen and why. This is quite a difficult question, so don't worry if you don't understand it or can't get it right, but it is a good learning opportunity, so I want you guys to try your best. Does it fail to compile at all? Does the app build but crashes immediately? Does main activity launch into the second activity? Does second activity launch and say test message? Or lastly, does second activity launch but says something other than test message? Give it a go. Because this is the recording, I'll be revealing the answer right away. So let's click run and see what happens. So, looks like it didn't fail to build, and the application did start up, but there's nothing on the screen. Answer 5 is actually the correct choice here. Test activity, second activity launched, but it didn't say test message. And the reason for that is because it tries to get its text from the intent. However, because we put this intent filter here, second activity in this case actually got its intent from the Android OS while it was trying to boot the application up. It didn't get it from main activity, the only place that actually puts test message into the intent. That's why when we try to get key message from this intent here, it doesn't actually get anything, and that's why the text in this case is blank. And with that, we're done talking about all the components of an Android application. So let's summarize everything and talk about everything that happens when we click on an application and make it run. So, the first thing that happens is the operating system will allocate the memory and start up all the backend nitty-gritty stuff that Android needs to do in order to start an application. The first part that we come in is the operating system will check our manifest file here to figure out kind of what our application is about, and more importantly, figure out which screen it should use as the launcher screen. From there, it's going to start up that activity, and it's going to create that activity, which is important because when it's created, it's going to run our own custom onCreate function. That onCreate function will first of all set up the UI to use the custom layout we created here. And then it will go on and define the logic and use the code that will power our application. When our application is interacted with, lambdas are used to make things happen, such as when buttons are clicked, for example. Hopefully that all makes sense, and thank you all for being here to understand the whole lifecycle and process of an application. That concludes the technical part of this workshop, and before I go, I'd like to leave all of you with some guides and helpful resources that will definitely help me when I learn Android development. The first thing I want to talk about is developers.android.com/guide, the first item. These are guides meant to help you along with your Android learning experience. These are well-written guides meant solely to help you understand different Android concepts, like how to work with activities or how to use a camera, and so on. The second guide I want to talk to you about is developers.android.com/references. This is more for if you've already decided on which views or Android components you want to work with, and you want to understand more of how that specific component works. So if you've already decided you want to work with image views, then you can go to the reference for image views to kind of get a list of all the member variables and functions belonging to an image view. Okay. After that is material.io. This is a Google-run website meant to help you learn and understand different UI UX concepts for specifically Android and mobile development. So, if you want the application you make to look pretty and be designed functionally, then this is an amazing resource. But if you're not interested in design as much, but you still want your application to look nice, then the last one is materials.io/resources. This page will have a lot of stuff to help you out and make your application look a lot more professional without all the work of learning UI UX. Two of my favorites are the font tool, which you can download your own one of their many fonts and use it for your Android application, and the icon tool, where you can download professional looking icons that you can use free of charge in your applications. I hope you find these resources helpful and help you out in whatever application you choose to make. All right, thank you all so much for being here, and I really hope all of you can come out of this understanding Android a little bit more. Hopefully you can use what you learned today to accelerate your Android learning journey, and I really hope to see some of your Android projects at the end of this hackathon. Thank you for being here.